Today I'm going to be talking about church engagement and how the local church can combat human trafficking. And let me just start with a quick story about a day in May of 2016 when I had a meeting with a young lady that soon became an executive director of a local anti-trafficking nonprofit. And I'd known that there was trafficking and things like that going on in the world. I wasn't blind to it, but I always thought that it happened someplace else. I knew, obviously, that there was prostitution and things like that happening within our community, but the trafficking of children and things like that, I just thought that happened in these far off places. And on May 4th, 2016, I woke up. somebody opened my eyes to the fact that that there were a significant amount of trafficking cases and victims in my own community, and it wasn't a small amount. There was a problem, and so it broke my heart. And as a church, we began to pray, and so I couldn't get out of my mind after that meeting my own children, and if anything happened to them, who would step in? And I was convinced on that day that we would need to take steps as a church to somehow tackle this problem of human trafficking. And went to my first Five Stones Task Force meeting. There were probably maybe a dozen people there. And Felicia, that was her brainchild. And I met wonderful people from law enforcement, from Tarrant County Sheriff's Office, Fort Worth PD, and then some folks from nonprofits and concerned citizens at this small group. And that group grew to about 50 different agencies, and 80 or so people to 100 people sometimes coming to the monthly Five Stones meetings. So we saw growth, and the church found a place in the midst of that. And so I just share with you, I know we have a lot of people from churches and pastors and lay leaders on the call. So this is sort of the primary verse that I go with from Psalm 82. Give justice to the weak and the fatherless, maintain the right of the afflicted and the destitute, rescue the weak and the needy, deliver them from the hand of the wicked. And so that was the passage of scripture that anchored me in my involvement in this, is to provide justice for the weak and the fatherless, and rescue the weak and the needy and deliver them from the hand of the wicked. And so really quickly, I wanted just to give some definitions for those of you who may be new. I know this is old hat for a lot of folks. We go over these definitions regularly, but in order to understand the problem, if you're new, sex trafficking is defined a little bit differently than labor trafficking, but we're going to focus more on sex trafficking today. We could do a whole nother webinar on labor trafficking as well and how they intersect. But sex trafficking, in which a commercial sex act is induced by force, fraud, coercion, or in which a person is induced to perform such act, has not attained the age of 18 years old. And then labor trafficking, similar, but it has to do with labor services through force, coercion, and the purpose of subjugation, debt bondage. It's slavery. And so however you want to frame this, forcing somebody against their will to act counter to what they would normally do is a problem. And so understanding the problem of human trafficking, I'm going to share some stats. I'm going to go very quickly just for the sake of your time. But human trafficking is a hidden crime, and I always try to describe it like an iceberg. That if you know anything about icebergs, on the surface of the ocean, you see this chunk of ice, this big mountain of ice. But if you were able to dive down under the water, you would see that iceberg is 4 times bigger than what you're seeing on the surface. And so when I go through stats and you're hearing from Detective Matthews and Officer Adams, you're hearing just the surface of the problem, and that much of this goes on in the darkness. And so human trafficking is a hidden crime. It's under the surface of the culture of society. Worldwide, there's estimated, again, this is an iceberg here, there's 40.3 million people are in slavery. The United States is the #1 country consumer of sex worldwide. Texas, there are estimated 79,000 minors and victims of sex trafficking. Pornography is rampant in our country, in our neighborhoods, and I would also say within the church as well. So pornography is a problem. It drives a lot of this. And then you also have these illicit businesses. There's an estimated 9,000 illicit spas or massage parlors, whatever you want to call them, across the country as well. Runaways. We have an issue in our country and in our communities with runaways. 1 in 7 of them, of the more than 23,500 runaways, will likely become victims of child sex trafficking. And whenever I think of a runaway, is what are they running to? They're actually running into the hands of a trafficker many times. Organized crime. The Fort Worth Police Department has identified 83 active gangs just in Fort Worth. And then finally, demand. 60,000 people will purchase sex this year in Tarrant County. And so those are some staggering numbers to think about. Here's some other totals that you can look at that will, this is from the Polaris Project, just how all of this breaks down. And I won't go into a lot of the numbers, but escort services, you've got illicit massage and health and beauty services, where that's oftentimes where sex trafficking and labor trafficking intersect. And then you can go down the line here. This is just 1 year from the report from the Polaris Project. Another way to look at this is by state. This graph is a little sideways looking to me. My dyslexia kicks in and I've got to turn my head to look at it. But if you look at California and Texas, they're leading the nation as far as human trafficking cases reported. And so again, going back to the analogy of the iceberg, we're just seeing the surface. So when you hear of these reports, in the news where they've made 30 arrests, in a city and broken up a sex trafficking ring, know that that's just the surface. As I stated earlier, the United States is the #1 consumer of sex worldwide. So we're deriving the demand as a society across the globe. The United States is. So we are very complicit in this industry. A multitude of kids are being sold as sex slaves in America today. These are American kids, American born. 50 to 60% of them are coming out of the foster care industry. I'll touch on that a little bit later as far as how the church can get involved. Individuals in the United States are vulnerable to human trafficking. These are the type of kids that are most vulnerable: children in the child welfare system and juvenile justice systems, including foster care, runaways, and the homeless. So you can see that the problem's large, but it's not too large. I'm going to make my thesis that it's not too large for the church. The roles and responsibility of the local church. My church folks will understand what a prophetic voice is. We use our prophetic voice. What that means is that we speak the truth about an issue. We don't sideline an issue. We see the issue and we call it out for what it is. And if we can speak to an issue with a prophetic voice, meaning the truth about something, then we also have a moral voice. We're using a moral voice. And if we're using a moral voice, we have a moral responsibility. If I say that something is wrong, I see something in society and I say that it's wrong, then I have a responsibility to actually do something about that. The second role and responsibility is to pray. The church must pray about this issue for our communities, our nation, and the world even, but pray about this issue. The church can equip the family unit and provide a family of faith. The church is the only institution left in America that has total access to the family, meaning that the children and parents are involved in a community most times within the church, and we can train and raise awareness within that family unit through the community of the church. And on the same token, when we have folks that are victims of sexual exploitation or trafficking, we can provide them with a family of faith so they can see what a healthy family, a loving family looks like. So we equip the family unit and we equip the family of faith. We provide resources and funding. It doesn't matter how much money your church, if you're from a smaller church or a large church, we can all take part in some small way in funding and providing resources to victims and to nonprofits, and even some cases law enforcement. We deploy volunteers. One of the biggest assets that the church has is people. And when we deploy volunteers, we have the opportunity to step into this dark area with people who care and are other-minded and really want to see women and children and men as well rescued, and then see them come into a family of faith where they can be supported. The sixth role responsibility is to influence culture. When we see things around us in the culture, the church has is an institution of this, a moral authority, has a moral voice to actually change the culture. We can say something about the culture. We can point out what is good, true, and beautiful in the culture, but we can also say what is evil in the culture and then bring about restoration into those issues. And so we can influence culture, whether it's making a video about raising awareness of trafficking in your community. You can put that out on social media and it has an effect, because we as the church can influence culture. Finally, we can be a collaborator in the community. And that's really what I want to talk about the most here for the remainder of my time, is how can the local church combat human trafficking? It's all about relationships. The church, for good or for bad, is built on relationships, our relationship with God and our relationship with one another. And when I say for bad, sometimes the church has not been good at relationships. We can always improve that, but that doesn't mean that we haven't ever been good about relationships. And so when we are intentional about building relationships with one another within our church community, we can then start building relationships outside the church. And the church is uniquely positioned in the community to combat human trafficking. So the key relationships and collaboration this is what I've sort of come up with from my experience. There are probably great models of collaboration in ways that organizations work together. I keep it as simple as possible, or I try to. But this is how things fell together for us. We didn't really go into this whole trafficking space with a strategy of like, we're going to do A, B, and C, and this is going to work out. This is all trial and error. So this is just a model, a way that Christ Chapel, our church, has stepped in, and then we look back and see what's worked and what failed and what we want to continue doing. And then we looked at the model and said, okay, this is how things fell out. So we have the local church, nonprofits, and law enforcement. And so the local church, as I said earlier, has influenced the culture, community, family, and we have volunteers, right? We also have resources. But the local church is a catalyst and a relationship builder in the community. That means we go outside our church community into the community and start looking for partners and people of peace that we can partner with and collaborate with in the community. And I would submit to you all that the first two places to go are law enforcement and nonprofits. Law enforcement has a tough job. I don't know of any law enforcement officer that's working in the trafficking space that won't tell you that, Lance, we cannot arrest our way out of this problem. It is way too big. Law enforcement, this thing is coming at them like a wave. Rarely are they able to be on the offensive. They're oftentimes defensive. They're receiving calls. They're, getting tips on potential trafficking victims. Now they will go on the offensive with some stings and things, but that's rare compared to the amount of defense that they're playing. And so the law enforcement's an apparatus of justice. It's also designed to protect the weak and the vulnerable. And it also law enforcement carries legal authority. On the nonprofit side, they provide resources, support, and advocacy. So as someone within the church that has a heart to combat human trafficking and see it leave my neighborhood and in my community, in my city, in my state, I want to see it ended. These two different institutions, law enforcement and the nonprofits, are the key of the collaboration with the church. And so I believe it's the job of the church to build those relationships, because we can be a mediator between law enforcement and the nonprofits as well to connect them. And then this slide is just about building community relationships. These are mediating institutions that we've identified, and then the governing institutions. Obviously, we have the churches, nonprofits. Some churches will have internal ministries for children, drug and alcohol, counseling, orphan and foster care ministries. So I added those under the church because your church may already have some of these elements that can help in fighting human trafficking. Governing institutions, obviously law enforcement falls under that realm. But I would say even before going to city government, particularly if you're in a large city, go to your local law enforcement officers and ask them what they're dealing with, and then work your way through the city and then the first responders and everyone else, because that's really the place to start. And then find that one or two nonprofit in your area that may be already in this space of combating human trafficking, and look to partner and collaborate with them. So as I said earlier, the church is uniquely positioned in the community to combat human trafficking. This is the domain of the church, as I've just identified pretty, simple as I can, is that we have the pulpit, we have prayer, family, we're a collaborator, we have volunteers, funding, and we have influence. Those are all things within the institution of the church, the domain of the church. When we move outside the church, we have the domain of the city. And that's where our nonprofits, law enforcement, schools, foster care system, and businesses are. And so we can reach out from the church into these areas, and it's not just limited to law enforcement and nonprofits. We can also partner with schools. We can also see how we can help CPS and the foster care system. What businesses maybe that are the owners go to our church that may have a heart to help you raise awareness and funding in this area. And throughout the entire time, we're raising awareness, training, addressing demand, legislative advocacy, and restoration. I'll get to those in a minute. So these are just some questions to consider. Is your church equipped to help a victim? Yes or no? If yes, great. Make sure that that people know that the nonprofits and law enforcement in your area know that your church is equipped to help a victim or someone that's experienced sexual exploitation. If you're not, then we can help give you some ways to do that. Just get prepared for it. Can your staff and congregation recognize the signs of trafficking or exploitation? That's training. There's all kinds of really great training out there. If you want to email me or connect after the Zoom call, I can help you with that. Just connecting with folks in your area. And then what steps can you take as a church? So this is where we get into more the 5 Stones framework of 5 Stones task force, is raising awareness. Can we have luncheons? Can we reach out to the city through the neighborhood associations and businesses to raise awareness of the trafficking situation in our city? Training and education. So oftentimes you can get a nonprofit, even someone from law enforcement, to provide training on what the signs are of someone being exploited or trafficked. You can bring in the public school teachers. We had 150 teachers from Fort Worth ISD come in and get trained on trauma-informed care and the signs of human trafficking. And we just hosted a lunch at our church, and it was, free, come all who may. And it was great because the teachers and the administrators at the schools really appreciated that training. And so that was another way to help. Addressing demand. I'm going to park here for just a second, just because this is the fulcrum over which the entire industry moves. This is at the center of it, is demand. And what I mean by demand is this is the demand for commercial sex. And this is mainly driven by men. And so this whole industry is driven by demand. If you take away the demand for the product, then you have essentially short-circuited the entire industry. You've undercut it. It goes away. And so when men speak directly to the church in regard to the stats we know about pornography, and we know what's going on culturally with sexuality and men in general, is that when men in the church stand up and say no more, it's game over on this whole thing. And I think that's important to know as a man in the church, that my church needs to equip me, challenge me, minister to me, help restore me if I've got a problem. And I can be a part of the solution. So the men are the problem, men are the solution. And keep in mind that 60,000 men just in our city, in Tarrant County, will purchase sex this year. And that, just breaks my heart. But if those 60,000 men stood up and said no, it solves a big chunk of the problem. Next is legislative advocacy. This is just getting involved both on a local level and a state level and even national level of supporting, first of all, knowing the laws, supporting the laws and legislation that are good, and then helping to create legislation where there's gaps. Talk to your DA's office, talk to your law enforcement, talk to the mayor's office and even your state legislature, and find out what the laws are in the books and see if they're good laws, and that traffickers are being prosecuted and victims are being served. And so that's a big part of the battle there that's not quite as, I guess, known or is legislative advocacy. And then finally is restoration. What happens when you do have a victim? There are great nonprofits out there that their main focus is on restoration. The victim is stabilized, they feel safe, they're able to make decisions, and then they can go into a long-term it could be 6 months to 2 years of long-term restoration, and it's life-changing for them. And that is a ton of hard work. All of this is hard work. The restoration piece is probably one of the most difficult. This and demand are two of the most difficult areas. But the church has the ability to make these things happen in the context of our internal church community and in the community at large. So the risk factors, understanding some of this is not exhaustive, but these are just some of the risk factors for children, and then solutions from the church. And so I've thrown these together. Hopefully they make sense. But, homelessness, foster care system, juvenile detention, runaways, childhood abuse, sexual or physical or psychological, extreme poverty, loss of a parent, substance abuse, lack of a support system. Those are all risk factors for children. Any two of those together, and you've got a child at a great deal of risk. Just one of them is risk enough. But if you when I've talked to law enforcement and others in the nonprofits, they tell me that these children are going through or experiencing multiple of these risk factors. The solutions from the church, these are all things that the church can get involved in, solutions that we can be involved in, and they're in line with the mission of the Big C Church. Nonprofit support, homeless ministries, nonprofits that are working in the trafficking space and the family space. CASA, I know we've got some folks from outside of Fort Worth on the Zoom here, but we have court-appointed special advocates in our family courts. That is a wonderful volunteer opportunity. It is difficult, but those CASAs in the family courts are the voice for children in the foster care system, and the judges listen to those CASAs. Youth outreach, family classes, training. So back to the signs of trafficking and exploitation, feeding programs. What's interesting to learn in the context of trafficking, particularly in the United States, is that when you deal with the hunger issue, oftentimes that will deal with the trafficking issue. Not always, but the trafficking issue, because a single mom, let's just use an example, hypothetical here, single mom with 3 children to feed, can try to work 3 jobs, or she may be able to sell herself in order to feed her 3 kids or pay her rent. Or so if we are strategic about how we're feeding vulnerable families, particularly single mothers with children, then we're helping deal with the problem. Counseling, addiction classes, and benevolence ministry. If your church has a benevolence fund for those who are in need in the community, leverage that. You can help victims and victims advocates as well through your benevolence fund. And contact me. I can also tell you how we sort of structured our benevolence fund to help in this space. But there's a lot of ways that the church can provide solutions. And again, these aren't all of them. First of all, when we go into this, we pray, we address human trafficking from the pulpit. This is an Imago Dei, an image of God issue that we can address from the pulpit, and we can then activate people within our congregations to take steps. I would recommend, these are my recommendations, is identify 2 lay leaders who are passionate and gifted to lead your church's anti-trafficking initiative. Because if you're a senior pastor or in leadership, your plate is full. And this is a heavy piece that will be too much for your plate. So you really have to identify those lay leaders that are passionate and are gifted, and that will lead your church's anti-trafficking initiative. Contact your local police department and learn how your church can help them. What are their needs as they deal with trafficking cases? and then identify and partner with local nonprofits that are working in the trafficking space. Bit of review there. So sort of to land the plane here, it is all about relationships and collaboration between the church, nonprofits, and law enforcement. The church is able to bring everyone to the table to build those relationships and start building that coalition or a task force to then combat human trafficking and actually see results. And one of my favorite people, William Wilberforce, said that you may choose to look the other way, but you can never say again that you did not know. William Wilberforce is my hero because he started off with just him and a couple of other people who ended slavery in England, and it was a catalyst that ended slavery around the world. He was one of the first abolitionists. He was a Christian. He was a churchman. They tried to get him to go in to be a minister, a pastor, and he chose to be a politician. Yes, there are some great politicians out there, and Wilberforce was one of those. He was a man that had a vision, that he saw something horrible in his time, the institution of slavery, and he said, no more, not on my watch. And so in the spirit of Wilberforce, in the strength of our Savior, Jesus Christ, we can step into these issues, and we can bring restoration into a very dark and confusing battleground. And the community, our children, depend on the church stepping into this. There's no other institution equipped that has the machinery that the church has to solve this problem. And it won't happen without the church, I can assure you. So if you have questions, my contact information is here. I've also included Felicia's information if you've got some questions or have a tip here in the Tarrant County area, trafficking or otherwise. And then I've also included the National Human Trafficking Hotline there at the bottom. I will be putting together a quick one-page on one of our websites that will have some additional resources and links to help you get started. And again, please take down my information and call me or email me if you have any questions. I'm here to support you and be a resource. If I don't have the answer for you, I will find it. And so I thank you for your time. It's so valuable. And I just pray and praise God for what he's going to do through his church in combating human trafficking in our time.